Learning objectives. After completing this module, learners will be able to understand and explain that unlike European nations, nationalism in India was associated with struggle against colonial rule. Understand and explain the link between World War I, Khilafat movement and non-cooperation movement. Understand and describe the philosophy of Satyagraha. Understand and describe the unjust aspects of the Revolt Act 1919. Understand and analyze the different strands in the non-cooperation movement. Understand and describe the widespread reach of non-cooperation movement and concept of Swaraj. Understand and describe the civil disobedience movement and Salt March. Explain the limitations of the civil disobedience movement. Explain how nationalism gave a sense of collective belonging to Indians. Nationalism in India. Modern nationalism in Europe was associated with the formation of nation-states, whereas modern nationalism in India is associated with the struggle against the colonial rule. Different groups of people felt colonial oppression in different manner and perceived freedom differently. Mahatma Gandhi attempted to bring these groups together for a concerted struggle against the colonizers. The First World War, Khilafat and non-cooperation. In the years after the First World War, enormous war expenditure was met through war loans and increased taxes. Custom duties were raised and income tax was introduced to generate more revenue. Steep price rise between 1913 and 1918 hit the common man badly. Forced recruitment of people in the army caused resentment. Failure of crop in 1918 to 1919 and 1920 to 1921 contributed to acute food shortage. The troubles were compounded by the spread of epidemic influenza. Against the hopes of the common man, the colonial rule and exploitation continued even after the war was over. Mahatma Gandhi appeared on the national scene during these troubled times. The idea of Satyagraha. Mahatma Gandhi returned to India in 1915 after successfully fighting the racist government in South Africa. His tool of protest was Satyagraha, which emphasized on truth and non-violence. A Satyagrahi was supposed to protest peacefully and not resort to violence even when provoked. Using this tool, Mahatma Gandhi successfully organized Satyagraha movements in Champaran, Bihar, Kheda district, Gujarat, and amongst the mill workers in Ahmedabad, Gujarat. Rowlatt Act and Non-Cooperation Movement. The Rowlatt Act. The Rowlatt Act, passed by the Imperial Legislative Council in 1919, gave unbridled power to the British government to repress political activity and detain political prisoners without trial for 2 years. Mahatma Gandhi initiated a nationwide satyagraha against the unjust law. Alarmed by the nationalist move, the British government arrested Mahatma Gandhi as also prominent leaders in Amritsar. On 13th April 1919, a peaceful meeting was being carried on in the Jallianwala Bagh, Amritsar. General Dyer blocked the only exit point and opened fire on unarmed people. Shaken by the brutality, people reacted violently in some parts of the country. Disillusioned by violence, Gandhiji called it off on 18th April 1990. The Indian National Congress passed a resolution at its Calcutta session in 1920 to launch a non-cooperation movement supporting the cause of Muslims as well as for Swaraj. Why non-cooperation? In Mahatma Gandhi's opinion, the British could establish themselves and rule us so long because the Indians cooperated with them. If Indians refused to cooperate, the British government would collapse in no time. Hence, he proposed a non-cooperative movement which required people to give up the titles awarded by the British government, boycott civil services, police, army, courts, legislative councils, schools, and foreign goods. Resort to civil disobedience if the movement adopted repressive measures. Differing strands within the movement. The non-cooperation and Khilafat movement that began in January 1921 had participants from different social groups. Each one responded to the call of Swaraj, but with its specific aspiration. The movement in the towns. The non-cooperation movement drew tremendous response from all, especially the middle class. Students left schools, teachers and headmasters resigned from government-run schools. Lawyers gave up their flourishing practice. But for Madras, the council elections were boycotted by all states. The Justice Party in Madras went ahead as it felt. Getting into the council was the only way to acquire power. On the economic front, the import of foreign clothes halved. From 102 crore, the value of import declined to 57 crore. It was a popular movement, but it slowed down gradually. Khadi was an expensive alternative to cheap mill-made cloth. The poor could not afford it for long. Similarly, to complete avoid British educational institutes, India needed its own setup of schools and colleges. These were not as fast to come up. Gradually, students and teachers returned to their schools, and the lawyers too resumed their work in government courts. Rebellion in the countryside. From cities, the non-cooperation movement reached villages, focusing on the struggle of the tribals and peasants. In Awadh, the peasants led by Baba Ramchandra, an indentured labor in Fiji once, wanted lower land rents, reduction of taxes, abolition of beggar, work without payment, and boycott of landlords. By October, the Awadh Kisan Sabha headed by Jawaharlal Nehru, Baba Ramchandra and few others was set up. In 1922, in the name of movement, people resorted to looting houses, bazaars and granaries. It did not find the Congress leadership's approval. Similarly, the tribal peasants in Gudem hills of Andhra Pradesh were denied entry into forests to graze their cattle or collect fuel, wood and fruits. Denial of their traditional rights angered them. They too misinterpreted Mahatma Gandhi's idea of Swaraj. Their protests took shape of a militant guerrilla movement, which was not in sync with the Congress's idea of protests. Swaraj in the plantations. Under the Inland Immigration Act of 1859, the plantation workers could not move out of the tea gardens without the authorities' permission, which was rarely granted. It severed the plantation workers' ties with the villages completely. They interpreted the non-cooperative movement in their context. They defied the authorities and headed for their hometowns. They were caught up by the authorities en route and beaten up mercilessly. Yet, while acting in the name of Mahatma Gandhi, they identified their movement to be beyond the confines of their locality. Towards civil disobedience. While Gandhiji withdrew the non-cooperation movement due to growing episodes of violence in February 1922, Siya Das and Motilal Nehru formed the Swarajya Party to contest elections to the provincial councils. Towards late 1920s, the worldwide economic depression impacted India too. The peasants faced miseries due to high taxes and rents, falling demand for agricultural goods, and declining exports. During these turbulent times, a statutory commission under Sir John Simon visited India to ameliorate the constitutional system in India. The commission was greeted with the slogan, "Go back, Simon." To appease the political parties in 1929, Viceroy Lord Irwin offered Dominus status for India and roundtable conference to discuss the future constitution. Radicals Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose still pressed for Purna Swaraj or full independence. The Salt March and the Civil Disobedience Movement. Through a letter on 31st January 1930, Gandhiji demanded abolition of salt tax from Viceroy Irwin. He had warned that if the demands were not heeded to, a mass civil disobedience movement could be initiated. On 12th March 1930, Gandhiji commenced Dandi March, that is, Salt March, from Sabarmati Ashram. On 6th April 1930, he reached Dandi, Gujarat and violated the salt law for manufacturing salt from seawater. This was the beginning of the civil disobedience movement. The colonial government arrested most of the important leaders, including Mahatma Gandhi. It evoked violence against all British symbols. Gandhiji withdrew the movement when the government targeted peaceful satyagrahis. When the Round Table Conference resulted in a disappointment, Gandhiji relaunched the movement. How participants saw the movement. Different social groups with varying expectations joined the civil disobedience movement. In the countryside, the rich peasant communities, Patidars in Gujarat and Jats in Uttar Pradesh, participated enthusiastically. They expected a reduction in high revenues they had to pay to the colonial government during the trade depression. They were disappointed when the movement was called off in 1931 without any revision in revenue rates. Smaller peasants, reeling under high taxes, were unable to pay rent to the landlords. To them, Swaraj meant remittance to the unpaid rent. The Congress sidelined it. It made the small peasants-Congress relationship uncertain. Bigger industrialists wanted elimination of colonial interference and restrictions on trade activities for a no-constraint business. For the working class, it was a fight against low wages and poor working conditions. The limits of civil disobedience. Gandhiji attempted to draw Dalits in the mainstream struggle, but some Dalit leaders wanted a political solution through reservations in educational institutes and a separate electorate to choose Dalit members for the Legislative Council. The conflict was resolved through the Pune Pact, September 1923. It allowed the depressed class, later called the scheduled castes, reservation in provincial and central legislative councils, but to be voted in by the general electorate only. Jinnah, leader of Muslim League, also demanded reserved seats for Muslims in the Central Assembly and proportionate Muslim representation in the Muslim-dominated provinces of Bengal and Punjab. The sense of collective belonging. Nationalism is a sense of collective belonging to a nation. Common culture, language, history and fiction, folklore and songs, popular prints and symbols, or loyalty to the nation, all foster a feeling of nationalism. Often figures and symbols are used to identify a country. In the 20th century, India came to be identified through an image of Bharat Mata. Indian writer and poet Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay first created this image through his poem Vande Mataram, written in the 1870s. He later included it in his novel Anand Mat. It was widely sung during the Swadeshi movement in Bengal. Swadeshi movement inspired Abanindranath Tagore to paint an image of Bharat Mata exuding calm, composure, divinity, and spirituality. Different artists presented it variously later on. As the national movement gained momentum, nationalist leaders realized the powerful role icons and symbols played in unifying and inspiring a feeling of nationalism in people. A tricolor flag, red, green, and yellow, with 8 lotuses representing the 8 provinces of British India, and a crescent moon representing Hindus and Muslims was designed during the Swadeshi movement. Gandhiji designed a Swaraj flag, red, green and white, with spinning wheel in the center in 1921. Indians started reinterpreting their history and eulogizing the past developments in art, architecture, science, mathematics, religion, culture, law, philosophy, crafts, and trade. Summary. Let us summarize what we have learned. Modern nationalism in Europe was associated with the formation of nation-states, whereas modern nationalism in India is associated with the struggle against the colonial rule. Against the hopes of the common man, the colonial rule and exploitation continued even after the war was over. Mahatma Gandhi appeared on the national scene during these troubled times and introduced Satyagraha. The Rowlatt Act, passed by the Imperial Legislative Council in 1919, gave unbridled power to the British government to repress political activities and detain political prisoners without trial for 2 years. In Gandhiji's opinion, if Indians refused to cooperate, the British government would collapse in no time. Hence, he proposed a non-cooperative movement. Different social groups responding to the call of Swaraj had their specific aspirations. From cities, the non-cooperation movement reached villages, focusing on the struggles of the tribals, peasants, and plantation workers. On 12th March 1930, Gandhiji commenced Dandi March, that is, Salt March, from Sabarmati Ashram. On 6th April 1930, he reached Dandi in Gujarat and violated the salt law by manufacturing salt from seawater. Different social groups joined the civil disobedience movement with varying expectations. The civil disobedience movement also had some limitations. Nationalism is described as a scene of collective belonging to a nation. Icons